Saurabh, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good. Good to see you, David.
Same here. It's been a while. I'm glad to catch up with you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining us on Band Business Books.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, of course. So, I'm, we've got a lot to cover. The topic of our conversation today, and of all the conversations in this series, is value creation. So, one thing I'm really keen to understand from people like yourself is, how does value get created? What are some of the techniques that businesses can use to find value, to capture value, to create value? And you have been a consultant with your own firm for quite some time and I have quite a bit of experience. And I think you're the perfect person to walk us through, from a consulting perspective, how do businesses, what are some of the best practices for creating value, Sarah? So, wondering if you can tell me, first of all, how did you find your way into consulting and ultimately get started with your own firm?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's like a value creation question in and of itself, right? So I was a liberal arts, well, I was a science major in undergrad. So I graduated from UVA with a degree in biology, having dabbled in the commerce school at UVA for a little bit because I knew wanted to be employed. And biology
Yes.
probably was not a path that I was going to pursue, right? So I love biology, but research was not something that I want to do with my career.
Got it.
So I started to think about, what that first job might look like. There's only so many types of firms that recruit at the University of Virginia. It's essentially investment banking, consulting, and accounting.
Okay.
And to me, knowing what on-ground recruiting looked like and knowing what knowledge gaps I had to fill, consulting felt like a really logical choice, right? So it was like within my path already. It was kind of like teed up as a potential career option. Also, having only dabbled in business, the whole promise of consulting was if you don't really know what you want to do exactly in business, this is a great way to get started, get exposure
Hmm.
to a lot of different industries, a lot of different types of problems, learn how to problem solve, and basically get a business school education hands-on on the ground, so that you can then figure out what you want to do later with your life. Right. So that was initially the foray into consulting was, can it give me some grounding and help me figure out what I want to do when I actually grow up. So that was 28 years ago at this
Right.
point.
Yeah.
I kind of stuck with it. But, to kind of rewind it back a little bit, that first job out of school, I was in consulting probably for about a 6 or 7 year period at that stage. And decided I'd had enough of consulting. I'd kind of learned what I wanted to learn. I wanted to get deeper in industry, running an actual functional area at a company. So I ended up working at a publicly traded company for a while, running their global strategic planning process. And what I realized during that brief stint is like what I really value personally is learning about new things, right?
Got
So
it.
that from a value creation perspective, this constant feeding of the brain with the next problem, the next industry, something that somebody else hasn't been able to tackle. Can you solve it for them? That drew me back into consulting. Um,
Did you find that working in industry compared to consulting was slower? Not as, maybe not as challenging, or was it challenging, or is it just different? How would you compare the two, to knowing that you've been on both sides of the equation?
it was definitely it was slower on the analysis, for sure, right? So I think that the slowdown in how many unique, new, and novel problems am I solving in any given year, that definitely slowed down. So I went from maybe delivering 5 or 6 engagements on a per year basis on average to tackling maybe 1 or 2 big strategic initiatives. In addition, those 1 or 2 things that I was tackling in industry were always in the same industry. Whereas in consulting, I was moving between healthcare and consumer goods and financial services. And so the newness of it all and the speed of it, I think were the two kind of big differentiating factors overall. That was coupled with a trade-off that at the time, and I've changed my opinion about this since then, but, in my 20s, it was coupled with a trade-off that I wasn't willing to make, which is being in industry came with a lot more political maneuvering inside of an organization to get your ideas from idea to implementation. And, late 20s, even early 30s, that's really not something that I wanted to focus on. I've kind of felt there was this purity to consulting, which, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But I felt
Yeah.
there was like purity to thought, and I didn't want to get my hands dirty with implementation. Like, I'll put it that way, just because of the political morass of getting all the buy-ins you need to work through that hierarchy.
Right. And I suppose you don't run into that quite so much as a consultant because at the point a consultant is hired, they've already cleared all the bureaucracy. The decision is made to hire somebody to come in to solve the problem. It's just your job to come in and fix the situation, right?
It had well, that was my orientation for a long time. Interestingly,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and for viewers, like you and I did work on a project together, and that project that we worked on together, probably about the initiative that we worked on together was probably 10 years ago at this point, 9 or 10 years ago, something like that.
Getting
Uh,
close to it. Yes.
Close to it, right? It's almost a decade
Yeah.
ago. And even with the general concept bought into amongst the senior leadership team at that company, there was still, in hindsight, a lot of political maneuvering that was necessary to actually get ideas sold in and then acted on, because each of the leaders around the room had common objectives because they're all working for the same company, but had differing objectives because they all had their own P&Ls that they needed to be able to both serve and protect at some level. So that was the first project where I actually kind of enjoyed the political maneuvering and saw it as deeply as I did, and that actually got us off onto a whole different platform in the business where we started to do not just upfront strategy work, but got much deeper into the implementation lifecycle. So that
Understood.
project corrected my notion around the politics and navigation not being something I wanted to do. It actually made me kind of fall in love with it at some
Okay.
level, because that's where the rubber kind of met the road and idea became reality, so to speak, right?
That's awesome. That's awesome. So we got off track a little bit there. The second part of my first question was, so how did you get into starting your own firm? You walked us through up until the point that you were in industry for a stint. So how did you get the courage and the gumption to go out on strike it out on your own?
Yeah. So I think the big motivator, I'll talk about the courage in a minute, but like the big motivator for me was I'd been at a couple of different consulting firms up until that point, from large ones like, Publicis Sapient, through to smaller boutique shops. And they all approach consulting very differently from one another, right? So even if it's all the same building block, you do internal interviews, you understand capabilities today, you figure out how market opportunity fits with those capabilities, you do some prioritization work, you build a strategy off the back of it. The degree to which, for a growth strategy project like that, each firm leaned into different methodological components, whether that's market research, whether that's internal analysis, whether that is financial engineering, was vastly different. And I felt like there was a bit of a shortcoming at the places that I had been in terms of how well rounded their service capability was. Right. So classic entrepreneur question, like, can you build a better mousetrap? So I
Hmm.
fundamentally I could build a better mousetrap. Like, can you take the things that work really well, combine them together, and the things that you don't enjoy doing or you think are low value add to clients, can you leave those behind? Because maybe they're window dressing that doesn't necessarily earn its place with respect to fee structure. So that was the big component. Somewhat flippant addition to that is I've never been a good employee. So I've always kind of struggled inside of companies to um, be okay with the rules or the guidelines that are put around you, right? So if you have a big idea, I feel like you should be able to go out and implement and execute against that idea. And as an entrepreneur, assuming you have the resources to be able to do it, or at least know how to meter your resources, you can do the things that you come up with, right? So this combination, I
Absolutely.
think I can do it better, and I want freedom to do it. Like that was pretty powerful. Um, the courage, I think, was the other part of the question. My dad asked me that question when I first started the firm, right? So I was making a pretty healthy paycheck at the time, and he's like, "Why?" And I had a baby on the way. My wife and I had a baby on the way. So my father was like, "Why in the world would you give up this paycheck to go do this thing? And don't you feel like you're taking on enormous amounts of risk?" Um, my first answer to him was, "I think I'm pretty highly employable, so I don't think the risk is that great because I think that if I wanted a job, I could probably find a job within a certain period of time." I had also saved up money, so I had a pretty decent amount of runway available to myself. Um, but the bigger part of it is, and, I communicated this to my dad at the time, and it's like been true since then. When you own your own company, you know what that runway looks like, right? So like I know what our billings are. I know how many months or quarters or years our billings carry us. I know what our resource pool looks like. I know the levers to pull. And that feels like a whole lot more control than when you're working for somebody else and you don't have total visibility into the financial health of a company. And you're at the whims of whatever EBITDA level, as one example, somebody else wants to be able to drive. So I felt like that awareness of the playing field that you're operating in, that to me feels a lot lower risk than working for somebody else.
I think you have to choose your own adventure in this world for sure. It sounds like you certainly were comfortable with your skills, your marketability, personally, professionally. I like what you say about the control of seeing your own inventory as a consultant. The resources you have, the projects you might have scoped out and on the way. I mean, that takes a lot of confidence still, I would say. So definitely a dose of courage is the way I would characterize it. Um, you certainly seem to take that leap, and you did it with some sort of measurement already in mind. So well done.
Appreciate it.
So Saurabh, I'd like to know, now we understand a little bit of, how you got into the world of consulting, thinking more specifically about what other listeners to this podcast might be able to take away about value creation. Uh, what are some of the fundamental tools that you use to create value in your practice? So if you had to say two or three things, like what's your toolkit look like in the world of consulting?
Yeah, so I was just to approach it from a consulting perspective, right? There is somebody told me early on consulting is a mentorship-based business. And like I've increasingly come to understand what that means over the years. And what that means to me is a lot of firms operate without an actual playbook, but the methodology is the methodology. And so the methodology gets handed down from a more senior person to a less senior person to a less senior person, and the chain kind of propagates over time. Right. So
Hmm.
the big question, and I've had, open tower strategy almost 18 years ago at this point. The big question that I wanted to answer early on was, can you begin to systematize consulting if we truly are applying largely the same frameworks over and over again and going through the same progression on a project over and over again? Like, surely there's a approach that's better than me just organically teaching it to somebody else. So, like, can you actually encode the methodology into a playbook that is highly repeatable, highly replicable, where a new person coming into the firm can easily understand it and apply it, and so that you can create consistency across projects, or so that became the foundation. And so, like, assuming that you can do that is like the first lever. The second thing that we then focused on, we focus on is how do you, if you've got a consistent foundation, make every single project better than the last one. So if your
Yeah.
base result is repeatable and predictable,
Hmm.
you're a lot more free to then innovate around that core, because all of a sudden you know you're going to deliver at a baseline level to what's acceptable to you. So what are those additional pieces of analytics, new frameworks that you can create, a new problem solving approach that you can attach to the core that you feel is very low risk and is highly doable because your brain is now free to think creatively because you've made the baseline so rote, right? So that's kind of the second big part.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood. So it's about, first of all, recognizing there's a repeatable process out there that's very high quality, and then mastering that gives you some sort of liberty, sounds like, to innovate more, to be able to provide that baseline level of quality, but at the same time, you're able to make adjustments given the particulars of a client or the problem that they need to have solved, right? That's what it sounds like to me, Sarah.
Yeah, that's right. And making sure you're not just because you have this common method, to your point, the risk is you become complacent because, like, I've done this so many times, I can keep doing it the same way over and over again and deliver success and repeat client business and everything else. So it takes culture building to
Mhm.
then challenge everybody to say, yeah, we could repeat that same playbook and the client's going to be happy, right? But like, how do we make sure that we're not satisfied with excellence the way that we've delivered it historically, but really stacking on top of that and redefining what value looks like in the future because a client's going to see something from us this time that they haven't seen previously. And as a small firm that's competed against McKinsey and Bain and BCG and PwC, we're
Hmm.
always having to overachieve to prove our worth in the room because we don't carry the same brand and automatic halo the moment that we walk in.
Right.
That make
Got
sense?
it. It does make sense. It does make sense. So, what would be, let's dig into that one, drill in a little bit more. So, you're talking about a repeatable process. What are, how do you, what does your discovery look like? So, a client comes to you, they say, "We've got this problem. Sorry, we need your help to figure it out." Or you're invited to an RFP, you're competing with others. So how do you initially talk to us about that process itself? How do you initially dig in, understand what the problem is, and then figure out how to flip it on its head so a firm can go and use your solution to create value?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I think it's probably 2 big things, right? One is there's a problem the company has. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the problem the individual has, right? So
Okay.
the first layer is what's the problem the company has. So we did a project, so it's always easier for me to talk in, speak with examples. So we had a client who had a product in their market that was underperforming relative to their overall portfolio with respect to profit generation. So the margin they were delivering on that product was below average relative to the rest of the portfolio. And the
Okay.
question they asked us was, how much do we need to raise price to get to the right margin level? What will that do to some other supporting financial metrics, right? Like return on invested capital? And what kind of volume drop off should we expect? And as a result, should we do it? And it's a really interesting problem, right? And that's like a relatively easy project to scope. You could do price elasticity modeling, like all sorts of stuff around that. Pretty rote. The
Got it. Yeah.
realization that we came to as they were asking us that question was they're looking at price quantity trade offs. But the question to me was much more about what's causing them to price at the level that they're pricing at in the market right now, which was not the stated question that the client had, right? So was there something about their product proposition or the value proposition in general that caused them to be isolated into a certain pricing band within the market? Or were there other behaviors? So one behavior could be, let's say the product itself is high volume and it's high dollar value, and they've got a sales gap at the end of every single quarter that they have to fill, and the product's in high demand. So can you juice your sales by discounting that product at the end of a quarter in order to drive up sales? And that's actually the bigger unlock that we found in that particular situation was it wasn't the price quality trade-off in the way that they had been thinking about it just through financial engineering and improving product performance or margin
Yeah.
performance. There were underlying motivations within the company to hit their revenue targets because of deficiencies elsewhere in their product portfolio that are causing all sorts of bad pricing behavior. So if we'd answered the question that they asked us, I think it would have been we could have answered that question and told them what the price quantity trade-off was. But and we did answer that question for them, by the way.
Yeah.
But the answer was, but maybe that's the wrong question in the first place. The answer was, maybe you should be asking this question instead. And by the way, we gave you this answer as well, right? So that was like fascinating to us.
Got it. Got it. So they were falling into the trap of using this one particular product for filling in gaps at the end of the quarter, and that's not unusual. I've seen that in lots of companies too. But it seems like they were unwilling to maybe admit it at the first, and that's why they asked you the original question that they did.
I think that's totally right, right? And I think that's part of the reason, people hire consultants is A, maybe to diagnose the problem in a way that they didn't, or B, maybe some people around the table know what the problem is, but you need somebody else externally to be able to come in and get, several senior executives who may disagree on the root cause and some of whom might be responsible for the problem in the first place. Maybe you need to create that exposure as an outside party because it's a little bit less politically fraught coming
Right.
from the outside.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Sarah, this leads us nicely into my next question. So I'm really curious about, and you were just talking about it, blind spots. So individuals have blind spots, things that we do well, but we also don't see the things that we don't do so well because it's behind our back, for example. Um, but companies as well might have a blind spot, like you just mentioned. So, what are some of the blind spots you've seen that companies have when it comes to value creation? Things that they just miss totally, or they don't get, or they do very well some things, but they're missing out on some other things. So, why do they often need the help of consultants like yourself?
Yeah, it's a couple of things, I think. One is, look, I think when you're in a market or an industry and you're so in the weeds of dealing with the things that you deal with day in, day out, there's another fire to fight, right? There's another irate customer on the phone, or there's an employee action that you have to take. It's really easy to get used to living with that pain and solving for individual pain points along the way, like an underperforming commercial resource, instead of thinking about, like, how is my market actually shifting around me? Have I lost footing commercially as a whole, not just this particular salesperson? Have I failed to move from hardware into software and AI as rapidly as I needed to? So I'm losing positioning within the market. Or so I think people get so stuck in the weeds, they lose the forest for the trees, right? So I think that's one thing. I
Right,
think the second big thing to me is companies tend to treat a lot of solutioning around the problems that they've got using in a function specific way, right? So we're gonna, our facility in Dallas, as an example, is, low margin or even negative margin because we do a terrible job of resource planning. And so what we need to do is implement a new ERP system into this environment. Well, the ERP system sure could help, but I think there may be, in our experience, it has been, there are probably issues around how manufacturing and R&D, commercial, supply chain are working together in the first place that an ERP system is not going to solve because, if you're low margin because your commercial teams are taking orders that they shouldn't be taking and there's no governance in place to make sure that they only take product orders above a certain threshold, like that's a very different system than what an ERP, this a very different issue than what an ERP system by itself is going to solve for, right? So these solutions become so micro at some level, and the cross-functional nature of actually moving an organization seems to bleed away at times. So I think that's kind of a second big, the big one. And the last one I'd kind of point out is, you get the situations where I kind of mentioned this earlier. There's a lack of objectivity because perhaps somebody has made a decision in the past that burned them that one time, and then they've forever sworn off doing that thing again as if that was the thing that caused the failure versus the way
right.
that it was implemented. Or maybe that solution was applied to the wrong market. And so I think people can get jaded by their own experiences versus really listening to and looking at the facts within the market and maybe breaking out of the preconceived hypothesis or notion that they've got, even if it's lived experience, right? It's still a lived experience, not necessarily the reality today.
Sure. That sounds like what I would say was recency bias of an experience. Like the last thing you did or the last thing you observed from your actions has a huge impact on what you do next.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I like what you said. Or your first point is for sure. I think the reason why consultants exist is to provide perspective. Is really what it boils down to. We're in the weeds. We can't see because we're neck deep with the day to day problems and the customer complaints or the factory problems or whatever. And so that's really why I think consultants are called to the court to come in and provide that overall perspective of what's going on. So that's very helpful, Saurabh. I'm wondering, my next question about the future of value creation in companies. I mean, there's no doubt that AI is going to play a huge part of how value is created. And I'm wondering how you see it. What you see the role of AI being in consulting itself, for example, in your particular field of play, and how value creation might be in the future with the help of AI.
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't think consulting in its current form continues to exist through the medium term, definitely not through the long term. I think it's a question of how fast the current model goes away and how deep that disruption is. But I think it's one of the industries that is most ripe for um, the business model, being blockbustered, for a lack of a better way to put it. And
Right.
here's why I think that, right? So I think there's no magic to consulting, right? Consulting is, can you take a problem that somebody's given you? Can you break it down into its individual little piece parts? Can you then build frameworks that address those individual components? Can you then do the research to populate those frameworks? Can you then figure out the so what's from that data that's flowing into those analytical frameworks? And then can you move an organization around that? Right. So if that's consulting, if that's a continuum, then all but that last piece of, can you move an organization like hearts and minds to do something different? All of that other work, AI is at a level at this point where it can do all of that other work. Now, could it do it perfectly? No. But putting a human at the center of it on a properly tooled AI to accelerate what that human is doing, allow the human to apply their judgment at the right points, collapses the consulting model. Now, I think that consulting is going to go one of two ways. Either companies will choose consulting firms to internalize those cost efficiencies, still charge high rates, right?
Hmm.
Internalize those cost efficiencies, and maybe change their model a little bit. Or companies, probably not the consulting firms, not the big ones, will choose to say, you know what? If I could encode AI to behave like a consultant, and I put that AI in the hands of my clients, do the clients then need to still hire consulting firms? No, because maybe the AI can function like the consultant, with the client user still being the client user, checking AI work product just like they would interim or final deliverables that their consultants were producing with them, but putting the client much more front and center in terms of the value creation journey and the value creation story. And I think there's a whole set of benefits to that for the client. That's not to say that there isn't a change management need there, and there aren't friction points, which we're seeing, that you have to solve for on that front. But I think
Right.
the whole consulting model is dead. It's just a question of if everyone's figured that out yet.
It's already dead, what you're
Yeah.
saying, as of today, or even some time ago.
Yeah, I think it was some time ago at this point.
Okay.
And I think people are tricking themselves into believing it still exists.
If if I'm a if I'm in a business school right now, am I quaking in my boots thinking about maybe one of the major paths for business school students being somewhat limited in the future?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I think if you're in business, if somebody's in business school right now and they're probably going into a profession that is knowledge work based, whether that's consulting or some other field, I would be quaking in my boots. And, from what I understand, um, recruitment levels at business schools, it's a much harder recruiting cycle this last year than it has been in the past. I think people have big questions around, and I don't have an answer for this, but I think there are big questions out there for what the future of work is. Is it in the short term, who can use AI the best? Is it in the medium term, who can take AI, human collaborated work product, and move it through an organization, perhaps elevating some of the either harder skills like, data analytics, or data sciences, to help with these models, or on the other extreme, more qualitative disciplines like general management majors or people who majored in psychology or industrial psychology to go take the analysis and weave it through the human capital side. I think there's, the squishy middle of like what a consultant used to be, for example. I think that's going
Yeah.
away. But I think it's like super hard skills and softer skills that are more emotional intelligence based. I think those probably emerge as premium skill sets in the future versus, what people hired for back when I started 28 years ago.
Right, 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 right. And I think one of my main motivations to speak with you and to work on this series on value creation is to document what it means. What what does value creation really mean? Because there's a piece of me that wants to think, maybe I'm wrong, that this is a human endeavor. The actual value creation, that there's something human about it that AI will replicate, maybe better or worse, but there's a piece of this that needs to be understood by humans, and it needs to be driven by humans too. I might be wrong. What do you think about that?
I agree fully, right? I think it's just the role of human in value creation changes. If you take the things that were high value creating by humans, like the ability to build a sophisticated financial model, which AI is still bad at math, right? So there's still space for that. But if it takes something that was previously high value for the human, let's say doing basic market research, like that used to be a high value activity. There are entire firms that have and were built around that. That work in many cases can be done in you know seconds, minutes, hours now versus days and weeks or months. So if you take that type of human value creation activity away, or you commoditize it and collapse it, I think there are other places where humans can create value, and companies are still driven by humans. So there's plenty of value creation activity around that. That is the human to human interaction, right? That's the work that we
Right.
do together. um, how do you take the analysis and go drive somebody to go do something about it? I think that's hugely valuable. How do you even ask for the right analysis up front? Right? There's still a scoping need and a scoping requirement to understand what the question is, because AI is not an oracle. It's not an all-knowing being. It doesn't know the inner workings of an organization. Right. So there's still on the boundaries of AI, I think, enormous value creation opportunity. It's just this middle component of what we used to see as hard skill sets. I think that
Right.
part's going away.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Sarab, and for sure. I mean, I was looking at solutions that are doing market research that basically speak to AI agents or sim I guess a simulation, AI simulation of what a random person would say, and the results are 80% of the way there in terms of what you would get if you compared it to an actual human survey.
Right.
So you're right about that. I mean, there's parts of the entire process that are going to be totally automated, and we'll just take that as being good enough, right? As we do
Yeah,
for a lot of things.
absolutely. And the models are moving fast, right? So we're really about 3 years into this journey as like at a mass market level, and that's how far we've come. So 3 years out from here and 3 years out from there, just like you start to trace that out, and you start to really think that 80% might be at 85, 90, 95% in the not that distant future. And so value creation is still important. I just the role of the human in value creation shifts. And I think that if I was in business school right now, I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son. That's the active conversation that we have is, great, you wanna do you wanna go to undergraduate business school, but what is the path, like, after that? Like, what is the actual path that works for you, not just being a consultant like dad? Because this job in this form probably doesn't exist in the future.
Hmm. Well, that's a very difficult conversation and thought process to go through because we've been doing this for some time where we just automatically follow the paces and we assume that the college education is going to deliver us to the career and the career path is going to be there. But it seems that all of a sudden the first step to the career path is they're the first jobs that are being done by AI, and so it's a treacherous journey for sure.
Agreed.
Hmm. Well, Sarah, I want to say thanks for your time joining me today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation about value creation from a consulting perspective, and you definitely walked us through some really interesting parts of how you got started and how you create value in your job, and then the future of consulting itself. So appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's always a fun conversation.
Same here. All right. Well, let's keep it going.
Sounds good.